Again, going through all the slides, and now we will focus on the content. We began with the biblical record, which takes us from 2000 BC to 135 AD. We discussed covenants, the Abrahamic covenant, Moses, how he relates to the Abrahamic covenant. We saw the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the actual land that was taken by the Jewish people. Speaking of land, we explored the land covenant at the end of Deuteronomy. We saw how Joshua relates to the Abrahamic covenant. We saw the provision of the Davidic covenant, which ties everything together with the promise of a king to guarantee, an ultimate immortal king on an eternal throne who will guarantee all of these covenantal promises. We saw Solomon's understanding of the Davidic covenant. We saw, even though that Solomon controlled this area, it actually wasn't a fulfillment of the prophecy. That wasn't actually technically Israel. That was just the influence of Solomon's kingdom. We saw after Solomon, the kingdom divided in 931 BC into a northern and a southern kingdom. Northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. We saw the prophets. We saw the prophets reveal the new covenant, which we just mentioned in our time of communion today. And Jesus, of course, elaborates on it as we discussed. We saw the destruction and deportation of the northern kingdom in 722 BC. We explored the exile and return of the Jewish people in 605 to the early part of the 6th century BC. We saw the Greek occupation of that land from 333 BC to 164 BC. And we saw after the holiday of Hanukkah, which we celebrate in more or less December every year. This year, it might even, because everything's late, it might push to January. I don't know. I haven't looked that far. End of maybe I think it's actually Christmas week. We saw the Hasmonean kingdom, free and independent Jewish kingdom. What was the problem with it is that it was not authorized by God. It functioned quite well for a time, for a century, but it was not authorized by God because it was not led. The kings were not descendants of David. They were priest kings, the Maccabees, and in 63 BC, the Romans came and occupied the land, and we discussed the Roman occupation. This is the division of the land under King Herod, their puppet king, their vassal king, if you will, whom they installed on the throne. When Herod died, the property, the power was divided into several different parts. Sons of Herod, one of whom was Herod Antipas. You've heard of him, you know him from gospel times. We saw, of course, the connection between Yeshua and the new covenant. We saw that today with the words that Yeshua gave, the body and the blood, establishing, ratifying the new covenant with his death, which is now the operative covenant under which we, as believers, whether we're Jewish believers or non-Jewish believers, Gentiles, we are operating under the new covenant at this time. It is not a renewed covenant. It is a new, separate, and distinct covenant from the Mosaic covenant. We discussed at some length the First Roman Revolution that began in 66 AD, ended in 73 AD, resulting in the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the carrying off of multiple Jewish slaves and all of the temple treasures on parade in Rome. This is the Arch of Titus, famously presenting that moment, and ending finally in 73 AD with events surrounding the conquest of Masada, when the remaining zealots, surrounded by Rome, about to be overrun by Rome, decided that night before to commit suicide. We discussed the Second Roman Revolution which began in 132 under the leadership of a guy named Shimon ben Koseva, who is known by Rabbi Akiva, was identified as the Messiah, the son of the star, Shimon Bar Kokhba. This is called the Bar Kokhba revolt.
וואו, מצאנו השבוע במדבר יהודה.
And I do want to show you, I'd mentioned that, let's go back and show that again. Can we scoot that back to the beginning? Yeah, fantastic. This is that video I said, just this month, they discovered coins. It's not the first thing that they discovered from Bar Kokhba, but just the latest to demonstrate. So here's the little video just to show you this. Wow, here's their, they've got captions. Wow, this week found a rare coin in the Judean desert. Okay, let's watch that.
וואו, מצאנו השבוע במדבר יהודה מטבע נדיר. הפעם הייתה לנו הפתעה. במסגרת סקר מדבר יהודה שרשות העתיקות מנהלת בשבע שנים האחרונות, בשיתוף משרד מורשת וקמ"ט ארכיאולוגיה במינהל האזרחי, מצאנו מתחת לאחת המערות צרור מטבעות. בתוך אותו צרור מטבעות היה מטבע מאוד מיוחד, מטבע נדיר של אלעזר הכהן. אחת ההשערות במחקר שאלעזר שמופיע על גבי מטבעות מרד בר כוכבא הוא אלעזר המודעי. אלעזר המודעי היה תנא, תלמידו של רבן בן זכאי, בן תקופתו של רבי עקיבא, ובעצם הוא היה אחד הדמויות ההיסטוריות שחיו בביתר. נמצא של המטבעות האלה בעצם מספר לנו את הסיפור של הפליטים, המורדים, שברחו למדבר בתקופת מרד בר כוכבא, שנמלטו לשם מפחד השלטון. אנחנו סקר מאוד מיוחד, אנחנו יורדים לכל המערות, כדי לאתר את אותם ממצאים שנותרו מהפעילויות, ממרד בר כוכבא ומתקופות אחרות של אותם אנשים שהגיעו בתקופות קדומות. מזג האוויר במדבר משמר בצורה מדהימה את הממצא האנושי, את העדויות לפעילות האנושית שיש לנו במערות, ואנחנו ממש יכולים לבוא וללקט אותם מתוך המערה. רשות העתיקות מזמינה את הציבור הרחב לקחת חלק בעשייה ארכיאולוגית, לעזור לנו במבצע סקר מדבר יהודה. הציבור מוזמן להשתתף איתה.
Let's move on. Just to show you that indeed people are finding stuff all the time. Week goes by, another discovery, not only of history, but of the Bible, and in immediately following Bible history, which is the Bar Kokhba revolt. Anyway, bottom line, we saw that the result of the defeat of Bar Kokhba was there are two revolutions, both ended in disaster for the Jewish people. Jerusalem became devoid of Jews. The Jewish people were expelled from Jerusalem. The city was renamed Aelia Capitolina by Hadrian, the emperor. And Judea was now known as Syria, its northern neighbor, Palestina. That's why we call it Palestine. That's where the name Palestine comes from. Which, again, we saw last week, named after the ancient enemies of the Jewish people. It's like poking a finger in the eye of the Jewish people, which, of course, if we read Zechariah, knowing that the Jewish people are the apple of God's eye, I wouldn't recommend that anybody poke their finger in the eye of the Jewish people. Going forward with the historical record, we looked last week at the Byzantine era briefly. That's the Eastern Roman Empire, which reigned over the territory of Palestine from 300 to 600 AD. This was their province. You can see Palestina and Arabia and Syria to the north. This is another division of the land by the Byzantine diocese in the 400s. And then we move to the Muslim conquest. This movement that began in Arabia swept across the region, and by 636, the Muslims had arrived in Palestine and they conquered this area. Their ascendancy is from 636 to 1096, although it will not be the end of the Muslim influence in this area. It will be interrupted by the Crusaders. We'll talk about that just in a moment. But during this period of time, very early on, in the exact spot of where the Jewish temple was, in order to demonstrate superiority over the defeated Jewish religion, the Dome of the Rock was built, and its adjacent mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The dome is the same dimensions as the dome over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, indicating again superiority, higher of course, being on the Temple Mount, indicating superiority over both defeated religions, the Jewish religion and the Christian religion, the ascendancy of Islam. Just the way things were done, that's how they thought. That was their thought pattern. But their control of this area is interrupted for a 100 and change, 100 years and change, from 1096 to 1204. There's 4 series of crusades. It's not just crusade, because there are 4 waves, 4 successive periods of time when the papacy commanded that Christendom, all Christian soldiers who were able to, go retake the Holy Land from the infidel, i.e. the Islamic presence. Go liberate Jerusalem. It is not right for Islam to be superior over Jews, okay, but for no, Christendom can't possibly be okay. So let's talk about the Crusades. Beginning in 1095, 1096, Crusaders are commissioned to liberate the Holy Land from the control of Islam, and successive waves of Crusaders wash over the Holy Land. And control of Palestine fluctuated back and forth between Christians and Muslims. Often crushed in the middle, however, were Jewish communities. Because as Christendom traveled from the European centers of England and France and Germany and Austria, as they made their way east down to the Holy Land, there were a great number of Jewish communities that would have been on their route, that would have intersected their route. And because the idea was to liberate not only the Holy Land, but to put down the infidel, and since the church was considered by the Pope and by Christendom as it existed at that time to have replaced the Jewish people, well, for the Jewish people, 1,000, 1,100 years, 1,200 years after the time of Jesus' death, they're still around, and the church having taken the place of it, how could the church have actually taken the place of the Jewish people if the Jewish people are still around? So, because the Jewish people were considered to be Christ killers and guilty of deicide, as if it was such a possible thing for a human to kill God, the Crusaders thought 2 for 1, okay? Since we're in the neighborhood anyway, while we're on the way, we might as well kill a tremendous amount of Jews, okay? And do God a favor. We'll get rid of the Islam, we'll get rid of the Muslims, but before we get, a little entr'acte a little warm-up, a little amuse-bouche, and will massacre centers of Jewish communities. Which is what happened. So, Crusaders repeatedly massacred entire communities of Jews. Why? Because they were given a choice. It wasn't like the Christians were completely heartless, after all. The Crusaders weren't completely heartless. They gave them a choice: convert to Christianity or die. So it wasn't just die Jews. It was die Jews or join the people threatening to kill you. See, it would be a real shame if anything were to happen to this Jewish community. You can avoid that by baptizing, by joining the Christians. Jewish people were not going to do that. That was an offer they could refuse and did refuse. But it cost them their lives. When we think about the reticence, shall we say, the hesitation of Jewish people to consider the claims of Christ, the claims of their Messiah. See, the thing is, before they even get to the actual person of Yeshua, of Jesus, before they actually get to interact in their minds with the teachings of our great shepherd, they must first overcome centuries of persecution that the church, or those who claim to be representing the church, misguided Christendom, had treated the Jewish people despicably. So how is it that, this is why I always understand the reticence of Jewish people. Because, most of us from our perspective, 21st century, the Jewish people, that's old, that's ancient history. If you're even aware of the ancient history of Jewish persecution, which, by the way, not that ancient, Holocaust was less than 100 years ago. It's only 80 years ago at this point. Had to have a historical perspective. And I promise you that Jews have an historical perspective. And it is that historical perspective, as represented by the heinous acts of those acting in the name of Christ and under the banner of the church, that the Jewish people have to overcome these things. It's not easy. Some cannot get past the history of the church, history of Christendom. For some, it becomes a convenient excuse, but for many, it's an honest impediment that is simply too high a hurdle to get over. That's the history of the church. So we can't pretend that the history of the church vis-a-vis the Jewish people is spotless and beautiful and loving, because it's anything but. The Crusades being a great example of that. Well, Crusaders, over this 100-year plus, almost 200-year period of time, as you can see, they're not calling this area Palestine anymore. It's not known. It's known as the area of Jerusalem's obviously a city, but it's known as the state of Jerusalem, or more simply, the Holy Land. And the Crusaders are in control of various other locations as well. You can see the beginning of Asia, the bottom part of Asia Minor there. Turkey, Armenia, and Syria. They have Antioch, they have Cyprus, So you have crusader states. And surrounding the crusader states is a sea of caliphates and emirates and Islamic control, which is why the crusaders don't wind up staying for very long, why it takes 4 waves, and why eventually it is a failed mission. So as the intensity of the Crusades begin to wane, conditions become more favorable in this area, I'll just call it Palestine, as it remained under Crusader rule. If you can imagine, when you're stuck as a poor and helpless series of communities in an area that is hotly contested in a war between Islam and Christendom, the Jewish people literally caught in the middle there, the residents there, and it was not easy. We already discussed what it was like for the Jewish people to live under Islam, the humiliation of being second-class citizens and paying the jizra, the tax of being a dhimmi, not a dummy, but a dhimmi, of a second-class citizen. But nonetheless, once the Christians took control, there was persecution, but it became better than the warfare that had existed. And in the Crusaders' wake, following the Crusaders, came large numbers of European Jews from the diaspora who were eager to permanently relocate back to Palestine. Why? Because, first of all, their experience in Europe had been, prior to the Crusades, had been miserable. They were persecuted, and they were a persecuted minority wherever they were, oftentimes exiled from a land that they had been in for 300, 200 years, whatever, time to get out and move to a different location, segregated from the population, not allowed to integrate in any way, shape, or form. And then, of course, the Crusades and the terrible massacres that had existed post-Crusades had created a powerful incentive to get out of Europe. So large numbers of European Jews came and relocated back to the Holy Land. That way they could escape the inquisitions of Spain, the exile from Spain, from England, from France, from everywhere they set their foot. They'd been exiled. The persecutions, the forced conversions, and other assorted European Christian torments. Okay. And again, I'm not saying the true church or true Christians acted in such a way, but because societies, entire nations, were considered to be Christians, that means that whether or not you were an actual believer, an actual follower of Jesus, or whether you just lived in a community that was called Christian, you were considered to be Christian, and therefore you got with the program. Okay? And the program, more than living a holy life, was persecuting and killing Jews in the name of God, to do God a favor. Well, Crusades end, and we begin to see in 1516 the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Now, that is not an empire of couch cushions and hassocks, okay? The Ottoman Empire were the Turks. And in 1571, the Turks take control of Palestine. You can see the Ottoman Empire as it existed in 1683, all the way until it ended in 1914. You can see by the 2 different shades of brown there, all the way through. So you can see there's Mecca, there's Medina as we As we move north, we see Jerusalem, we see Damascus, we see Syria. Now, at this point in time, the term Palestine is rarely used. The Ottomans considered this entire area simply to be a variety of provinces in their empire. And so basically they divided it into Syria and southern Syria, which would be Palestine or the Holy Land as we know it. So Syria and southern Syria. And this empire, the Turks, Turkish power, provided 4 centuries of political stability to the region. One of the great things they did, almost as soon as they took control of the Holy Land of southern Syria, is they built or rebuilt the walls. So the walls that we see around Jerusalem are, while they are built on the foundation of ancient walls, Roman walls. And you can see in this picture of the Damascus gate, you can see the original, you can see the Roman archway, the Roman gateway, okay, and how much lower it is than the gateway to get. So we see this kind of thing all the way around the city of Jerusalem, but these magnificent walls that we look at today and say, ooh, ah, those do not date from the time of David. Those do not date from the Roman time. Those were built by Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century. So when you go to Israel, that's what you will see. And so the Turks treated, however, the province of Syria, Palestina, southern Syria, and Syria, as a far away backwater, because look at Anatolia. That's where the action is. That's Turkey. That's where all the action, the main action is happening there. And Istanbul, which is right there at the center of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, right there in between Greece and Turkey. Istanbul used to be Constantinople. That was the center of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. It's now Istanbul. That's where the action is, okay? So the closer you are to Istanbul is where the action. So by the time you get all the way down to Syria or even to the Holy Land, to Palestina or southern Syria, it's a backwater. It has no political significance. And so the Ottoman Empire pays this region scarce attention. Now, while the Ottomans are in control, while the Turks are in control of this region, in 1850, you begin to see a movement rise, a movement called Zionism. A movement called Zionism. What is Zionism? Zionism is, Zion, remember, is a biblical name for Jerusalem or for Israel as a whole, for the Holy Land. Zionism is simply a movement that is predicated upon the idea that the Jewish people have a right to their ancestral homeland, Zion, the Holy Land, Israel, Judea, whatever you want to call it, Palestine, whatever you want to call it. So that's what in a nutshell, that's what Zionism is. That the Jewish people have an ancestral right to their ancestral homeland, which by the time we finished with our biblical and historical study, taking us from the time of Abraham all the way through past the New Testament, we saw, oh yes, the Bible is replete, it's pregnant, it is filled with a plethora of passages. It's hard to enumerate them all, impossible really to enumerate them all, that are predicated upon the idea that the Jewish people actually have a right to their ancestral homeland, that it is a land that has been given to them, that they lived there historically, they ruled there, they had a kingdom there. In fact, they had several. They had the original kingdom, it split, it had two kingdoms, north and south. They had the Hasmonean kingdom. So historically speaking, the Jewish people historically had an ancestral homeland and had their states there. That theologically then, we also can say, well, the Bible has a lot to say theologically about the right for the Jewish people to have the land. Not always to enjoy the land, which we discussed, not always to be present in the land that they own, but that it is their land, unquestionable. So that's the rise of Zionism. And during this period of time, right after the Civil War in America, you recognize this guy? Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. And Samuel Clemens took a world tour after, which by means Europe and then the Middle East, and then from Europe, Turkey, the Middle East, he made his way to Egypt and then back. So he recorded his travelogue in a phenomenal book, 1867, called The Innocents Abroad. The Innocents Abroad. And Mark Twain, because he's such a phenomenal writer, he relays in prodigious detail his impressions of the land's stark desolation and sparse habitation, with the exception of Jerusalem and a few other areas. In the time that we have left, I want to read to you a tremendous selection, first-hand selection. So, why am I concluding this? Because it's very easy to propose that the Ottomans had a vibrant and vivacious populace throughout the Holy Land, throughout their history, and that there were a tremendous amount of Arab people populating throughout the land. Because if everybody who claims that their family lived in the land for hundreds of years, okay, then in 1867, which is just 80 years earlier than Israel becoming a state and the War of Independence in 48, you would expect that there would be, the land would be teeming with population. Not so. That's why the recollection of Mark Twain is so very, very important and powerful. On page 606, Mark Twain writes this: "Of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. The hills are barren, they are dull of color, they are unpicturesque in shape. The valleys are unsightly deserts, fringed with a feeble vegetation that has an expression about it of being sorrowful and despondent. The Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, south and north, sleep in the midst of a vast stretch of hill and plain, wherein the eye rests upon no pleasant tint, no striking object, no soft picture dreaming in a purple haze, or mottled with the shadows of the clouds. Every outline is harsh. Every feature is distinct. There is no perspective. Distance works no enchantment here. It is a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land." Page 607, next page. "Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. Over it broods the spell of a curse that has withered the fields and fettered its energies. Where Sodom and Gomorrah reared their domes and towers, that solemn sea, it's the Dead Sea, now floods the plain, in whose bitter waters no living thing exists, over whose waveless surface the blistering air hangs motionless and dead, Dead Sea, about whose borders nothing grows but weeds and scattering tufts of cane, and that treacherous fruit that promises the refreshment to parching lips, but turns to ashes at the touch. Nazareth is forlorn. About the ford of Jordan, where the hosts of Israel entered the promised land with songs of rejoicing, one finds only a squalid camp of fantastic Bedouins of the desert. Jericho the accursed lies a moldering ruin today, even as Joshua's miracle left it more than 3,000 years ago. Bethlehem and Bethany, in their poverty and their humiliation, have nothing about them now to remind them that they once knew the high honor of the Savior's presence. The hallowed spot where the shepherds watched their flocks by night and where the angels sang peace on earth, goodwill to men, is untenanted by any living creature and unblessed by any feature that is pleasant to the eye. Renowned Jerusalem itself, the stateliest name in history, has lost all of its ancient grandeur and is becoming a pauper village. Pauper, as in poor person. Village. The riches of Solomon are no longer there to compel the admiration of visiting Oriental queens. The wonderful temple, which was the pride and glory of Israel, is gone, and the Ottoman crescent is lifted above the spot where, on that most memorable day in the annals of the world, they reared the Holy Cross. That's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The noted Sea of Galilee was long ago deserted by the devotees of war and commerce, and its borders, that's the area of Galilee, are a silent wilderness. Capernaum, talking about cities now in the Galilee. Capernaum is a shapeless ruin. Magdala is the home of beggared Arabs. Bethsaida and Chorazin have vanished from the earth, and the desert places round them about where thousands of men once listened to the Savior's voice and ate the miraculous bread, sleep in the hush of a solitude that is inhabited only by birds of prey and skulking foxes. He concludes by saying, Palestine is desolate and unlovely. And why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the deity beautify a land? Palestine is no more of this workday world. It is sacred poetry and tradition. It is dreamland. Why did I read such a lengthy passage from Mark Twain? Because it is first-person narrative, eyewitness account that the land of, and he started in Syria and made his way down, okay, throughout the land. He records for all posterity that it is not a full teeming and bustling region. It is sparsely populated, very small, isolated Jewish communities, and very small Arab villages and towns. By this time that Mark Twain speaks, the population of the Jewish communities within Palestine, a fraction of what it had been in past eras. Why? How did it go down so much in just 1,500 years, 1,600 years? Persecution, these are P's again. Persecution, poverty, epidemics, earthquakes, all played roles in decimating the populace. We will leave our study of the Holy Land in the Ottoman Empire right now. We will pick up the Ottoman Empire and the simultaneous rise of Zionism, not next week because we'll be doing the story of Esther. But in 2 weeks, we will tie together the rise of Zionism, the return of masses of Jewish people as the 20th century approached, and with the masses of Jewish people coming to the Holy Land, we will trace the Arab migration to the Holy Land as well, as things become very heated and exciting as the century turns over and the 20th century dawns. How far we'll get next time? Who knows? I'm enjoying the journey, as the people at Nissan tell us. Enjoy the ride. Let's stand for the Aaronic benediction.